Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk, Punch Feel Good, How to Design Satisfying Action Games. So my name is Alex Rushdie. I run a blog called ControlAllMonsters.com. I run a designer toy company called Seismic Toys. But most importantly to this conference, I'm CEO and creative director at 13am Games, an independent game developer based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So I've been in the industry for over 8 years, and my studio's mantra is that we like to make bold, stylish 2D action and multiplayer games. So we started off with Rumbo, and our most recent game, Dawn of the Monsters, launched this past March in partnership with our publisher, WayForward Technologies. Dawn of the Monsters is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that pulls liberally from modern action games like Bayonetta, God of War, and even Doom Eternal. The game was very well received, and we got to really push ourselves in designing satisfying combat and action that could maintain a player's interest over an 8-hour playtime. So personally, I grew up playing games in arcades, and I still love playing games in arcades. Arcade games can teach you a lot about efficient action game design since they really only have a few minutes to convince you to put in another quarter. And due to this fact, the vast majority of arcade games are blazing action games with an extreme attention to detail on game feel and responsiveness. But before we dig too deep into action game design, I'd like to attempt to define what an action game is. So recently I've made a beat 'em up, but a lot of the principles and learnings that I'm sharing apply to any number of action games. Game genres are really weird and dumb, and action games is an incredibly broad term, so I'll attempt to define it here. In short, action games are games where the challenge is derived from reflexes, hand-eye coordination, and fast pattern recognition, often under an overall time pressure. You don't level up your character so they can perform the actions, you improve your own coordination and reaction times so that you level up and you perform the action. The opposite of the action game is something like the traditional RPG or strategy game, which kind of has a layer of obfuscation between player and avatar. You manage resources, plan, strategize, often without any time pressure, and an avatar performs the actual action, moving, attacking, etc. So, to use a sports analogy, the coach of a sports team is playing an RPG. They're managing the resources of the team. But the athletes inside of the sport itself, the athletes on the team, are playing an action game. Now, obviously, nowadays, there are less and less pure action games, as RPG mechanics have invaded just about every genre in existence, even our own game, Dawn of the Monsters, but the point still stands. There are also plenty of genre hybrids and subgenres, and I'm going to focus mainly on single-player or PvE experiences as opposed to competitive multiplayer experiences, but a lot still applies to those genres. So we all know something feels good, but how do we design something to ensure that it feels good? This is a very different thought process when compared to other elements of game design. Game feel is one of the most important pieces of action game design. So the first thing I want to communicate is that action game design is a highly technical style of design, especially in games with a focus on combat. So to showcase this, I'd like to take a look at a single attack in our game and list off every element of it that needs to come together to communicate the impact in action. So this is a clip of Megadon, one of the playable characters in Dawn of the Monsters. This is one of his attacks. It's a super heavy punch and it's very powerful, so our team wanted to do as much as possible to communicate that power in a satisfying way to the player. So first off, if we look at all the individual components here, first off is the animation. So Megadon's animation here has to follow some important animation principles in order to communicate to the player the weight, strength, and impact of the attack. It has an appropriately long startup, a quick and snappy active period, and a nice clear follow through at the attack's end. It also makes use of an animation smear, as you can see, timed out so that it maximizes the feeling of speed and impact of the fist when it connects to your opponent and activates hit stop. So that's the animation for this attack. Next is the VFX. So when Megadon winds up, his fist glimmers briefly, indicating that he's charging an attack. As his fist flies, it breaks the sound barrier, generating smoke ripples around his forearm. And when it connects, it generates an explosion as well as an impact effect on the enemy. Lastly, it shakes the screen, indicating to the player that this is a powerful attack. This attack also triggers a special state that I mentioned before called hit stop. Hit stop can be incredibly useful in action games, and you see it in a variety of games from Super Mario Bros. All the way to Street Fighter. In our game, hit stop briefly pauses the two interacting actors, so Megadon and the person he's punching, to hold on an action frame and better communicate the power and intensity of a hit. So we spoke about the player animation, but what about the enemy animations? Well, for starts, once the enemy is hit, it enters a drastically different pose quickly to make it clear to the player that the attack has landed, that it's successful. The pose has to indicate some pain. You'll also notice that the enemy character kind of shakes a bit. This is called hit shake and is also a technique to indicate the power of an attack, as if they are building up momentum before they get launched away. And lastly, they get launched away. The enemy is receiving so much damage and power from this one attack that they fly off into the distance. And I mean, in this instance, they actually hit another monster and they both explode into a spray of guts. But if there wasn't a monster there, they'd actually hit a wall, trigger a new animation, new hit stop, and then bounce away from it. But that's not all. We've still got more to go. We have some audio considerations as well. You obviously can't hear the GIF, but trust me on it. Megadon vocalizes a roar that signifies the attack, and then the sound of an explosion and a bone-crunching impact upon hit, and the enemy monster screams in pain. There are also two more elements that are invisible and inaudible that contribute to the feel of this attack. The first is that in order to perform this attack, you actually have to hold the attack button. You can't simply press it. And the way you physically interact with this controller is a further communication of our intent that this attack is slow but powerful. It'll take a little time, but when it comes out, it'll be worth it. The other element is that the controller rumbles when the screen shakes to let you feel the impact of the hit. So let's look at that in total. This one attack needed 20 separate elements in order to communicate what we needed it to. That's one of the key tenets of satisfying game design. It takes a lot of work to make something feel good. So I can't go into granular detail about every aspect of action game design in a 25-minute talk, but I can give you 4 major concepts that can inform your design. So these are 4 concepts that I've learned through making action games that I feel are important to anyone trying to make an action game. So let's start with the first one. Let's talk about flow before we get into favoring the player. So flow is a game design psychological theory that's used to describe the state in which a player is fully engaged with the challenge in a video game. It's a state of hyper-focus where the player is so engrossed that they continue to play, losing track of time and losing track of self. The thought process is that flow is achieved when the challenge the player meets is appropriate to their skill level and increases in pace with their understanding of the game. It's what keeps them from wanting to go, it's what keeps them wanting to go to the next stage or fight instead of saying, this is enough for today, I'm done. Flow is broken when the player is out of the experience. Maybe the game's difficulty spikes too high and the player ends up quitting out of frustration. Or maybe the player discovers a strategy that the game never challenges and the difficulty becomes trivial, forcing the player to quit due to boredom. Action games are unique from puzzle, strategy, or RPG games in that the flow you experience is achieved through live physics interactions. The momentum of speedrunning in Sonic, or popping off a bunch of headshots in Doom, is a direct result of the physical feedback the player gets from the experience. The player skills that are the building blocks of this flow state are reaction time, real-time problem solving, and hand-eye coordination. However, these skills aren't equally gifted to everyone at the same rate and at the same time, and our perception of cheap, fair, and unreasonable difficulty is so incredibly skewed from person to person. So when I'm designing a game, I want to keep my players in that flow zone as much as possible for as long as possible. And things that break flow are difficulty spikes, deaths, and player mistakes. And to be clear, these flow breakers should almost, if not always, come from the player themselves. That can be a good thing. I mean, it allows them to learn and adapt and feel like they're conquering a challenge. However, there are a lot of little tricks designers can use to make sure players feel that they are better than they really are and keep them in that flow zone without risking boredom. For example, in Rumbo, which is a 2D platformer, not only did we give you a very generous collider that extends past your character's feet, so you can almost practically be totally off a platform but still sitting on it, we also give you a fraction of a second after leaving any platform to still input and register a jump. This grace period is practically undetectable unless you're looking for it, and no player does look for it, but in our testing it made a huge difference between players gauging their jumps properly and not. It also really pushes the extreme of failure, so when a player misses a jump, they always feel like it's their fault and not ours. Dawn of the Monsters plays similar to a beat-em-up like Final Fight or Streets of Rage, but the character hitboxes are way wider and much more generous than the enemy hitboxes. This is because it feels good to land a hit you think might not land, while it feels really bad to get hit by an enemy that you think is out of range. So essentially, I mean, it's good to be dishonest with your player. So this sequence in Mushihime-sama looks hard, but the actual collision data is really generous. The character's actual vulnerable spot is only practically a single pixel, and all of those bullets, regardless of how big they seem, also only have a single pixel of collision data to hurt you. This makes you feel way more badass and skilled than you really are. Most arcade shmups also reduce bullet speed, size, and density after each death, allowing the player to get further than they would have if they had never died. It's to coax you and convince you to keep coming back and playing. Even Resident Evil 4 had a pretty cheeky system to keep players moving through the game, where every time you died, the game would reduce difficulty in subtle ways, number of enemies, ammo, and health drops. And many people didn't even know this existed. Capcom never mentioned it. It's just a secret little lie to keep players in the flow zone and keep them playing. So that's favor the player. Next is hard is easy, easy is hard. So this is one of the most important things I've learned, and frankly, it doesn't just apply to action games. It applies to all game genres. The gist is that designing difficult scenarios is actually relatively easy. It's very easy to get a clear and desired response from a player when presented with a significant challenge. Humans are good at finding patterns and problem solving, so throw something tough in front of us, and there's a very good chance that we'll push through until we figure out the solution. But to be frank, that's not necessarily fun for a lot of people. I love a good challenge, but there are plenty of folks who would rather unwind and enjoy games at their own pace. And even the most hardcore gamers are unlikely to stick with a game that beats them down from square one. The real challenge is to make scenarios that are easy, but still engaging. A lot of games really struggle to make easy fun, and if you need any evidence of this, take a look at the easiest part of any game in the past 10 years, the tutorial. To take something incredibly simple and unchallenging and keep it fun and engaging takes a lot more work than to make something hard. I cannot stress enough the importance of this in platformers particularly. Our industry currently has a bit of an obsession with tough as nails games, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it means that experiences really focused on the joy of fun are lacking. It's no surprise that the vast majority of levels in Super Mario Maker are just stupidly hard. Ask someone to use Super Mario Maker to make a really tough level, and they can do it. Anyone can do it, really. If you ask someone to make a warm, relaxing, easy level, it's probably going to end up boring unless they're really good at level design. Easy, low-challenge experiences have a very important place in the pacing and accessibility of a game, and if you need tips on how to make easy fun, I suggest studying ludology, looking at play park design, and understanding theme park design. Okay, so number 3, it takes 2 to tango. This is believe it or not, a truncated list of all the actions that Bayonetta can do in the game Bayonetta. She has tons of combos. She's got a perfect dodge, a dodge offset mechanic, the ability to turn into a cat, the ability to turn into a bird, and lots of other stuff. But none of this would mean anything if she was fighting sandbag enemies. You can have the most in-depth, complex, and robust player mechanics in the world, but it doesn't mean squat if the scenarios and encounters are bland and don't actually utilize, test, or force understanding of those mechanics. Sonic the Hedgehog has a jump, he has a spin dash, he has a rolling spin, a drop dash, and he's got to ramp up to max speed, but those mechanics aren't meaningful at all if the level design in his games were filled with, precision jumps, flat planes, and platforming puzzles. So if you invest time in complicated player mechanics, that means you need to invest even more time into the things they interact with to make those mechanics meaningful. You also should consider forcing the player to use as many of those mechanics as possible. It's totally okay to have mechanics that are optional and are purely for mastery, but make a conscious choice about which mechanics they need and force them to learn them in ways they can't avoid. This is a mistake we've made before and paid dearly for it. If players find a foo strategy or a first order optimal strategy, then they will use and abuse it until something challenges and undermines that tactic. If they find something that nothing, prevents them from continuing to use, why would they stop using it? And if nothing comes along to challenge that tactic, they're going to get bored. And if they're bored, their flow is broken. Now, the last thing is considering mechanical offloading. So as designers, we are often trying to pack as much as we can into our games while keeping them accessible to as many people as possible. This can be a struggle, and when it comes to meaningful player mechanics, it is very easy to overcrowd a character and overwhelm a player with inputs and concepts and mechanics they are expected to know all at once. One way to deal with complicated character mechanics is to slowly, over the course of hours of play, reveal them to the player through level tutorials that guide their learning of a mechanic. Then, after hours of play, they can master all the different functions they need to know. In a game like Bayonetta, this can honestly take multiple playthroughs to master and explore all of her mechanics. But another way to offer a lot of depth and variety with player mechanics is to offload them onto the environment. What do I mean by this, and why did I include an image of Balan Wonderworld? I will explain. So let's talk about Mario. Mario seems like a pretty simple to control character, but in reality, he can do a lot. In some ways comparable to Bayonetta. Here's what I mean. So let's look at it. So he's got his walk, his run, his jump. In a lot of games, he has a run jump, right? If you're running at high speed, your jump mechanics change. But if we start to add things on, he's also got the ability to break blocks. He can collect coins. He can hold objects. He can throw objects. He can kick objects. He can climb. He can spring jump. He can swim. He can slide. He can go down pipes. If we add in his power-ups, he can throw hammers. He can swim better and jump better. He can, become invincible. He can do front flips. He can even fly. Depending on the game, Mario might have more than 20 different actions that he can perform. The key element is that Mario can't perform them all at once. Many of Mario's mechanics are spread across environmental obstacles, specific environments, or power-ups spread throughout the game. If Mario had all of his player mechanics all at once, it'd be absolutely overwhelming, and the gap between core and casual players would be immense. I don't even know how you'd map all the inputs for all those abilities onto one character. And then levels would be expected to support and make use of all these mechanics or let them become vestigial. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Offloading mechanics is something that we did in our second big game, Double Cross. So in some games, climbing walls might be an unlock or a special input, like you hold trigger and walk up to a wall. But in Double Cross, you can only climb where we say you can climb. It's where there's purple climb slime. And climb slime is only in certain climbs. No climb slime, no climb time, and that's no crime. So when you think complexity is getting too high and you want to simplify your mechanics, consider making them appear only for a level or two instead of cutting them entirely. Now, Balan Wonderworld is the most extreme example of mechanical offloading I have seen in an action game, where you can't even jump unless you equip a costume with that ability. So also be careful about veering too hard in one direction as well, where you create a single button game. So in summary, design your game to account for human error and favor the player in your interactions. Be cognizant of the fact that it's harder to design easy but fun challenges than it is to design difficult challenges. Don't give your player a ton of moves and options unless you have a way to prove that each one is worthwhile. And consider offloading player mechanics onto the environment in order to limit the complexity of your controls. And that's it. Thank you all for taking the time. Those are the 4 things I've learned. Feel free to follow me or my blog. I hope something here was useful, and thank you all for the opportunity.